Welcome back. This is the fifth and last of the 5 criminal justice videos, and the shortest one. We were looking at the panopticon and different architectures of correctional facilities and how those are built around certain presumptions about what's effective and what's necessary. So I'm going to show you an image now that's going to be a little offensive. This is of a lynched. This is an actual photograph of a lynched black man and some white people surrounding this. This is a deeply offensive and difficult image to look at, so I kind of blended it a little bit. Not that I ever sanitize things. Of course, we can talk about anything, but I just wanted to have us kind of reflect on that a little bit and what's at stake and how prevalent this has been in our nation's history. And so one of the things that's important to consider when we take a look at punishment as a logical conclusion to the criminal justice process in some cases is how historically corporal punishment has been a very common conclusion to that process. And this is typically considered a punishment of the body. So as you probably recall from your history classes, your other history classes, that people would be pilloried or they'd be mocked. They'd have to wear a scarlet letter. They would be locked in stocks or tortured in public. These were very common forms of punishment up until the Age of Enlightenment. This is one of the guiding principles behind the Eighth Amendment. This is an opportunity to reform that treatment of this new country in the 1790s. So instead of doing business as usual, but trying to create a new system that was based on these Enlightenment ideas about dignity and fair trial and the system being fair and its application being fair. But the thing that's a little bit more notorious is this tradition of vigilantism, which became not uncommon in the frontier areas as we expanded westward throughout the 19th century. One of the guiding principles behind vigilantism is this idea of what we might call jury nullification or frontier justice. So nullifying something that a jury has decided. So this is often cited in some of the accounts of those who lynched people, black people in the South. They believed that the justice was not served if this one person that they believed was guilty was not adequately punished. So they would take it into their own hands. Lynching is a specific form of vigilantism specific to America, and it became known around the world. It was not just this dirty little secret. So I don't know if you know about Edgar Rice Burroughs, who wrote Tarzan, but in Tarzan, this was written at the height of the lynching era. This is a man, Westerner, a white man who is raised by apes, and he learns kind of a problematic thing. He learns how to lynch, how to string up and kill people. I think he starts with another ape, that sort of thing. It's just kind of disturbing and interesting, but that kind of imagery wove itself into mainstream culture even 100 years ago. So this is not just a secret that we're sort of now uncovering. And usually there's this tradition of torturing and dragging someone behind a car or a wagon before hanging them. I mean, all parts of that are without due process and terribly, terribly dehumanizing, to say the least. So there are different forms. And we can ask similar questions of our system. Is it humanizing? Is it fair? Is there some sort of due process? And is that due process as effective and principled as it could be? And those are some of the pressure points that we look to the Supreme Court for to decide some of those things. So again, just a couple slides here. One of the things that is helpful to keep in mind is another form of punishment besides corporal punishment of the body is killing someone, an execution. And in some, again, the most egregious cases typically can result in capital punishment. So this is death penalty. Is the death penalty the ultimate consequence for a crime? Aside from a belief in life after death and eternal judgment, there are other questions to be asked about this. Can sitting on death row be worse than being relieved of that anxiety and dread and those conditions? Are there other things that can be served by not executing someone? These are some things that it would be helpful to kind of think about. And college is a great, moment and experience and opportunity to do that before you get out into your life and not have to deal with this very much. Or you might be thrust into a job in which you're not asked your opinion about these philosophical approaches. So some of the common issues in the controversy of the effectiveness of capital punishment are cost and deterrence and retribution. And some of you have studied this already, I'm sure. But interestingly enough, it actually there are some fascinating sides to this debate. And you can, we're not going to debate that right now. I would love to set aside time to kind of recruit some more information so we can make more informed opinions about that. But that was not the point of what I was doing here, just to kind of give you an overview of these issues. Historically, there have been 5 technologies that are legally allowed for executing people in some cases. Most of these are not used, or actually some of them are not used at all, but it's not because they're prevented. In some, I think in one state, there's hanging is still allowed, firing squad is allowed, but most of them are through electrocution, lethal injection, and more commonly, and also the gas chamber. So again, there are a couple things I want to add to that in just a moment. The term moratorium ironically means a sort of a killing of the death penalty. That's the ironic part, but it means pausing or de facto sort of cessation of capital punishment. So what has happened is it is now in general it is considered a constitutional in some cases, capital cases, to for a state to execute those convicts. There has to be that whole process going up through appeals before that happens. But under some circumstances, that can be constitutional. What a moratorium does is it effectively stops that. So without creating new laws, what that does is the governor of that state will say, you may convict this person and sentence them to death, but I'm going to commute their sentence. So I'm going to let you know in advance that you're just wasting your time if you do that, because I'm just going to, because I believe in this moratorium. And many states have done that. So it's effectively killed the death penalty in some states, but not in all states. So one of the things that has changed in the past 50 years is we've gathered a lot more data about people who have been wrongfully executed. In other words, they've either been convicted of crime that they didn't commit and went all the way to death, or the nature of that process has been botched or problematic. People have found through genetic testing, which is a very new technology, have found a whole bunch of holes in some of these cases of people who have been on death row or have actually been executed wrongfully. And so you can look up the Moratorium Campaign, the Innocence Project, and Amnesty International for more information about that. So it's just kind of a nightmare vision to think that you have not committed this crime and you're going to be killed by the state legitimately for a crime you've not committed. And so, admittedly, those are, proportionately speaking, small in number. But again, if you put yourself in that place, is the job of the government to err on the side of punishing anyone who might have committed those crimes legitimately, or is it to back off from that and to prevent that? And those are good philosophical questions to ask. So what is the most practical and humane way for a state to take a life if it needs to, if it feels that that's important? And so we get to the last slide here. A couple of cases that I wanted to share with you. Louisiana versus Risk Waiver. This is an interesting case in which someone was going to be executed by the electric chair. and they were electrocuted but not killed. And so here's this person who witnesses said endured a horrific experience. His heart did not stop. He responded afterward. And there's this question: what do we do now? Do we, the system was set up for a particular kind of a surge of electricity, and it didn't kill him. So if they do it again, is that kind of reconvicting? Is that a cruel and unusual punishment? Is that double jeopardy? And obviously there's something very cruel about extending that. But in the Louisiana versus Risk Waiver case, they said it was the malfunctioning of the machine does not change the fact that in general that technology is not in violation of the Eighth Amendment. And New York has an interesting place, a role to play in that story, because it was tried out because of Thomas Edison trying a particular kind of currency to experiment on human beings legally. So hooray! And we did that in upstate New York. The capital punishment was on trial for about 10 years when it was considered, from 1966 to 1976, a cruel and unusual punishment. But in Gregg versus Georgia statutes, they found that the statutes allowing execution do not violate the cruel and unusual punishment clause. But again, we have the moratorium, which is more of a political approach to the death penalty. Oh, sorry, I lied. There's one more. Thompson versus Oklahoma. Oh, yes. So capital punishment for the convicted murderer who was 15 years old at the time of the crime is considered cruel and unusual punishment. So again, we get to that issue of accountability, culpability at the age of 15, and again, proportionality, the punishment fitting the crime for someone who is a minor. This is a case that just happened last year, or was just decided last year by the Supreme Court. There were 8 members of the court. Kavanaugh had not taken the court at this point, and what came of that was there was a man who had developed dementia while he was he'd been on the death row for about 30 years, I think it was, and at the time leading up to his execution, he had so much dementia he didn't understand what the execution meant, and so in that particular case, just enough justices believed that would be abhorrent, offensive to humanity, to put someone through that. It became a moot point because this man eventually died of stroke-related symptoms, and so kind of sidestepped the issue. What would happen if that had been decided differently? And then finally, a case that was decided the end of last term, 2019. There was a Muslim who committed some terrible crimes and was on death row, and he had requested an imam. He was a Muslim, and he wanted a spiritual guide with him, which comported with his deeply held religious beliefs as a Muslim, and that was denied by the state. They said, "Well, we're providing you a Christian chaplain, and that should be good enough." And Brett Kavanaugh and some of the newer, more conservative justices believed that should be good enough, and we shouldn't bend over backwards, even for people like that. And so we see with this new, the current majority on the Supreme Court, kind of attack towards in favor of execution. They're sending a lot of signals that some of these things are seen as pandering or not as important as executing the law, which is definitely a clear message with the new court. And I think that's pretty objective. It's not my opinion. So think again about Max Weber's state monopoly on executing its own people, and also think about what's at stake in the process: the rights, the victims, the survivors, the convicts, the laws and ideals. There's a lot at stake in these big issues of capital punishment, and ultimately it might be helpful to think as good, well-meaning people or as Christians what is proper in these cases. Anyway, thank you so much for your patience and your involvement, and that's the end of this 5th and last slide on capital about criminal process. Thanks again.